Welcome to Identity at the Center Live. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey Jeff, how are you?
Oh, not so bad. Yourself?
I'm good. Can you tell I'm here in prison? I got the brick wall behind me. I'm in prison far in the north. I haven't obviously seen the sun in uh, months.
Yeah. Well, it's wintertime. We were on a Teams call earlier today, and you had your background going, but you weren't on screen. And I was making a joke about talking to you. It was like a brick wall. I thought that was pretty clever. But that was just me.
Yeah, well, yeah, we got into a whole conversation about backgrounds and green screens on one of my other calls.
Mm.
You know, what's funny is if I have the green screen software running and I don't have the green screen behind me, but it's in the background and like it's just like taking up part of the screen. You still see whatever the image is over the green screen. It's
Yeah.
kind of funny.
It's kind of a cool special effect, I think. But yeah, whatever. So, what is this thing that we're doing, Jim? I'll let you intro it this time.
All right. So on a weekly basis, we are taking a half hour break from work and live streaming to whoever's really interested to listen, participate, submit questions, submit comments. And we're going to talk about what our week was in the IAM world as IAM consultants. You know, we help develop IAM strategies and roadmaps for our clients. And then we're going to talk about some IAM in the news. Mostly, we're not taking the super, just news articles or um, boring stuff. We're trying to pick things that have kind of an edge to them. It'd be fun to talk about. We want this to be a little more fun, a little bit more relaxed than the podcast. Certainly, I think the podcast is super fun, but I wouldn't think of it as relaxed. It's discussional. Where it's a discussion, but it's there's planning that's involved with it. We bring a guest on every week, so it's more strategic or more more scripted. It's not really scripted. I don't know. Help me out here. I feel like
No,
I'm
I think
digging
it's
myself into a hole now.
what is this thing they were doing? No, I think you hit it right. I mean, I think it's a different medium. I think the one thing I like about doing the live stream is, you know, it gives us an opportunity to have a live conversation with people. Well, as live as it gets. I think there's like a 10-second delay, right? So if you're watching out there in the stream, feel free to type your name in and tell us where you're from or what are some IAM questions you have, anything interesting you guys might have worked on during the week. But that's not something we can do with the podcast because it's obviously recorded. Kind of hard to do that live interaction. So that's kind of the thing. And really, it's just kind of freewheeling, loose trains of thought, and at least in my case, I feel definitely very loose trains of thought as we kind of go through gut reactions of things that either you and I dealt with throughout the week or individually, or maybe just stuff that we thought was kind of interesting in the news. So maybe we should start with the podcast and kind of talk about what's coming up, because this is actually our first live stream since new episodes have started for 2022. So we took a few weeks break through kind of like December and the first couple of weeks of January of not recording podcasts. We kind of do that every year. I think that's just kind of our thing. A lot of people are kind of in the office anyway. I was on vacation, but we still started up this live stream during that time as kind of a slow roll. Let's kind of figure it out as we go, very much how we did the podcast. But now we're back. 2022 is here. And as of the time of this recording or this stream, which is Thursday, January 20th, we released our first episode of the year for 2022, which was January 17th, and that was a conversation that we had with Den Jones from Banyan Security. We talked about zero trust in 2022. What does that actually look like? And I asked one of my favorite questions. Okay, so what's good enough, right, from a zero trust perspective? Because there's like this moving target, I think that sometimes people are trying to hit. So I'm excited to kind of get the podcast rolling again and start putting out content, on that weekly basis. And so that was kind of cool.
Yeah, that's one of your that's become one of your go-to lines. What's good enough? And I think you've gotten so much positive feedback from it. It's like every time you say it, people are like, "That's a fantastic question, Jeff." It's kind of like one time I was at an IAM conference and I was doing a presentation, or I was on a panel, and I said, IAM needs to be thought of as a program, not a project. And it's like I got a standing ovation.
Who is this guy who's just like, like bravo, right?
Bravo, so genius. I mean, did you think of that yourself?
Well, you got to be realistic, right? I mean, if you're in our space, which is consulting, and you're in the vendor space, I think there is this kind of drive to like sell, 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 which means, oh, they got to do everything. They got to be best in the world. And that's just not realistic for most organizations. And they don't need to be, right? I think, okay, so what's good enough? Like, what do I need? Because where do I stop? Because it just gets more exponentially harder, more expensive, whatever it is, to get smaller and smaller returns on that investment. So let's get to good enough. I'm sure there's plenty of things to work on, so you can kind of focus on something else, get that to good enough, and then hopefully you've kept up good enough everywhere, but else you haven't, right? You spend, and whether that's time, money, resources, whatever it looks like, to bring the good enough level back up. I don't know. I just think I feel like it's like pragmatic from a strategy perspective, no matter what. It is even something for identity. I think it's just, hey, let's be good enough and kind of go from there.
Yeah, I think it's genius in its simplicity. I mean, we do IAM consulting and we get hit with a lot of questions. You really need to kind of have a framework for thinking about identity that helps answer the question, right? You need to be able to pull from the well. You can't think of an answer on the fly for every question that comes through. And so, a lot of times what we're doing is we're developing a maturity assessment. So, like, this is where you stand today. Where do you need to get to? Well, you need to get to good enough, whatever that is, right?
Right.
But on kind of a scale of 1 to 5, it's usually 3. Like, you're below the bar today. You need to work to get to the bar. Now, obviously, going beyond good enough is better, right? Everybody will admit that. But where you have to be, you have to get to good enough. And one of the things that we also always say about this is that getting that good enough bar keeps moving, right? So what is good enough today, 2 years from now, might not be good enough or won't be good enough. We already know that.
Yeah.
We've seen it enough times that we say it's a fact.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's the evolution of everything: security, IT, people in general, right? Processes, even politics. Like, well, what's considered acceptable today may not be considered acceptable in the future, or vice versa. So you just kind of have to continue to adapt to the times, and it's pragmatic, it's realistic. It's, hey, we know things aren't unlimited: time, money, resources, whatever it is that you're investing. Let's figure out what the right things. And I think that's a message for a lot of people, like, to think about. It's like, okay, what matters? Like, if you're looking at something, like, and you're trying to figure out, okay, do I need to put this specific workflow maybe in my IGA system and versus privilege access management or whatever, I think the question answers is like, okay, so what? Like, what does this get me? Like, why should I even care about this? And I think if you're critical of yourself and the strategy and how you're approaching things, I think that gives you a leg up, because then you can at least articulate why it's important, or maybe it cuts some fat from things that just don't need to be there, right? You can kind of trim out things that don't add value, doesn't spark joy, right? If that's the case, pull it out of there and move on to the next thing. You can always get smarter. You can always come back to it if it turns out that there's some reason to reevaluate it. But I like to keep it simple, and that's just my way of doing it.
So kind of the track that we're on in the discussion here was talking about the podcast, and Den Jones helped us kick off the year, and it really put us on the track of what I've been calling the CISO Perspective series, and Den was a huge help with that, right? But right after Den, we talked with Adam Michael, Texas A&M IAM program lead. He's going to be our very next episode that goes live. Then we have about 4 or 5 CISOs lined up over the rest of the first quarter. And really, I think it's just, if people aren't listening to the podcast now, they probably aren't listening to this then. But if they're not listening to the podcast, it's just such a great way to get perspective from people who are in the trenches and from different perspectives. I mean, like, we talked to Archit Lokahara. Yes, Lokahari. Dang it, I got the name wrong this time.
If you listen to the podcast, you'll know where this comes from.
Right. So, I mean, man, I'd say the last few episodes we've had people who are super bright, super articulate. Don't know why where that puts us.
I don't know how we got them, but hey, we'll take it.
Yeah,
right?
how we got them, but we'll take them. No, but these are people who are just fantastic in the industry, and really glad that they joined. And are you listening to many podcasts now? I think a lot of people used to listen to podcasts on their drive to work, and very few people have drives to work anymore. I still listen to podcasts. I'm like the guy who will throw it on when I'm on the treadmill. I probably consume 5 hours of podcasts per week.
That's a lot. I
It's a
don't
lot of
listen
time
to
on the
anywhere near
treadmill.
that much. Well, yeah, I guess if you're on a treadmill. I'll be honest, I don't listen to that many podcasts. I don't even listen to our own, but I lived it, I edited it, so I kind of know what happened. So I don't feel like I
Yeah.
need to listen to it again, except for like if there's something I want something to check out or something like that. I'll be honest, the only podcast that I have consistently listened to probably in the last couple months has been the new It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia podcast, which I'm a fan of the show. And it's kind of cool to hear the guys talk about kind of like they're going episode by episode chronologically of kind of the background behind each one, and then also just being silly goofs along the way. So if I'm listening to podcasts, it's generally more for entertainment than for information. But every once in a while, you'll send me something. I'm like, okay, I'll check that out and listen to an episode.
Well, you know me. I'm not afraid to give kudos to kind of the competitive podcast. The Risky Biz podcast is fantastic, and the CooperCole
Mm-hmm.
podcast is also very informative.
Yep, both are good.
You know, I
Identity
think
Unlocked with our friend Vittorio is great too.
Identity
And there's
Unlocked.
what's cool is they're all different enough where I think they, I don't see it really as kind of competition. Like the one that we do is very much conversational, kind of informal, but I think it's like an easy listen, right? It's just kind of a couple people talking about identity for whatever topic it is. Risky Biz I think is definitely more like news and kind of opinions, but also more current events and things like that.
Current events, and it's broadly infosec based, but
Right. Yeah.
they wind up talking for about a half hour every week about ransomware.
Yeah. Well, that's because it's the thing du jour, right? Everyone's hit with it. Vittorio and Identity Unlocked gets into more of like the standards and a little more technical conversation around some of the things behind identity. And then the analyst chat, I think, is kind of a little bit all over the place. Kind of depends on where they're going with it, but that's kind of their role, right? As analysts for a major firm.
Right. I mean, they have a lot of good perspective, and we love to have their analysts on our show. That's right. That's their each week they bring somebody from CooperCole onto the show, so it's their analysts.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one way that it varies from ours.
Yeah.
It's very very good, but yeah, I think that it's great getting all these different perspectives. That's really what I love about our show is getting the perspectives.
That and no commercials. We don't advertise. Not even ourselves.
Just advertise for the podcast and for the
Right,
live
yeah,
stream.
except for like the last 10 minutes on a live stream. Let's talk about our work weeks, because I think one of the things that's always, at least I like to hear, is like, okay, so what are some of the interesting things that happened, at least to us, maybe individually or together? Anything interesting from an identity perspective that kind of crept up as part of your last week or so here?
Yeah, one that's been on my mind is we're on a kind of a pre-sales call with the organization, and we were asked the question: how would you approach marrying up your IAM strategy roadmap with your HCM roadmap? So HCM being human capital management. Essentially, what they were leading to was, without all the detail, was they're moving to a cloud-based HR solution. And so what is so interesting about this, we've run into this a couple of times where an organization, especially large organizations, end up moving to some kind of cloud HR solution in phases, right? They're not moving everybody at once. Maybe they're doing it geography by geography, or maybe they're approaching it as business unit by business unit. And at the same time, you're trying to implement identity management, which typically starts with the HR system as the source. So
Right.
when you've got something that there's a major upheaval going on with your systems that are core to IAM, how do you factor for that in your IAM strategy? Uh, I think at some level, you don't want to tie your IAM strategy too heavily to that roadmap, or your IAM roadmap too heavily to your HR roadmap. There has to be some level of independence. You can't say, well, we
Mhm.
can't do anything until this HR or HCM project wraps up.
Right. Then nothing will
Um,
ever get done.
Nothing will ever get done, right? I
Yeah.
think, you almost have to say, right, it's going to be great if that happens, or if it happens on time, and if it doesn't, here's plan B. I believe in planning for Plan B. I'm a planner. I saw somebody who had a post on LinkedIn today saying, "I don't believe in Plan B because if you're taking away your focus from Plan A, then you're taking away your focus from Plan A. You've got to make that happen." I don't think that's the right approach for something like this.
Yeah, I think that'd be reasonable with what are the contingencies, right? Everyone has a contingency. What happens if something happens? I think that's just natural. It makes sense to plan for the things that could potentially go wrong. And I think when I think about trying to align like an IAM roadmap with a any other IT project roadmap is what are the interdependencies? Obviously, for something like an identity source, an HCM system, if it's going to be an identity source, it's pretty important, right? We need to know the who is before we can answer who has access to what, or at least to do it effectively. So I think this is where you really need to leverage those relationships and that partnership with that area of the business, because they're not going to be successful when it comes to delivering like onboarding, right, for new employees or offboarding and things like that. And you're not going to be successful if you're dependent on them for identity data that doesn't exist. So, I think my advice would still stand, I think, is make sure that there's a good relationship there. And if the IAM team can be part of the, planning, advising, whatever it is for that HCM team, great, because that's just going to help everyone down the road say, okay, yeah, we know you guys are moving to, I don't know, Workday, right, or something like that. Here's what we need in the identity side to be able to facilitate these services. And you can work all that stuff out during the planning phase, because there's always something to do on identity. Doesn't mean you have to stop the whole, rollout of an IGA or anything like that. There's always kinds of prep. There's connections for systems, ticketing systems, right? I mean, downstream, all that stuff that needs to get done. Role development at a very basic level can begin. So I think there's always stuff to be done. And I think that's where the guidance of what's the contingency? What's the plan B? Okay, well, let's say HCM is supposed to be available November. Okay, November is a terrible time to go live with anything because Thanksgiving. Then you get into Christmas and New Year's and all the holidays around that. So then it becomes, okay, what if that misses their time frame? Now all of a sudden your project is basically already a quarter off, because you're probably not going to get back up and running fully until mid-January, when people are kind of back in the office and can remember their passwords to log into their systems and things like that. So what could you have been doing in the meantime if that data feed wasn't there? So maybe you pause onboarding, or maybe account mapping or account correlation, and you work on, hey, let's start working on the quality of the data, cleaning up systems, other downstream connections and things like that could be done. Maybe even an access catalog of some sort for self-service. So I think these are all the things that you build in. And if you've got experience on the IAM program management side, is you kind of hope for the best, but you got to plan for the worst, right? What if this isn't available? You can't just like, okay, well, we're going on hiatus and break. Call us when you're ready. nobody's gonna want to do that.
Right. But I think like HCM happens in phases, IAM happens in phases as well. Neither one of these types of projects is big bang. And so, the source of identities, we always talk about this as a holy war. Where are the non-employees going to be managed? If they're not going to be managed in the HCM, that's an option to go after managing that portion of the user base first. Usually, though, to have real functionality of an IAM system, you need to have the authoritative source for just about everybody. You need to at least have some notion of their existence. I think the other IT system that could have a similar level of impact to an IAM deployment is your ITSM. And the question becomes, okay, well, what role does the ITSM play in your IAM management? Is it simply a ticketing system? So is it just kind of an endpoint? Is it kind of a shadow IAM system where some of the systems or some of the access gets managed in ITSM? So, or is it fully integrated where you want the front door for all this access to go through ITSM? So I think that's kind of the most strategic way to use ITSM relative to IAM, but it's a pretty heavy lift, I think. And I think also you have to really be on be on an investment that be on a platform that you've been investing in.
Yeah, you mean like the ITSM platform?
Right.
I mean, that user experience is, if you end up using it as your front door for IAM services, man, pay attention to what that user experience is like, because that's what people are going to go into to request access, remove access, changes, all that stuff in between. You got to make sure that that's locked down. And some do it better than others. I think every organization, this is one of the things they struggle with. I don't see this. I don't think it's gotten too much better, honestly, in the last 5 years, 10 years or so since I've seen this. The concept is there now of like this shopping cart approach, right? It kind of like, I like to draw the analogy of like e-commerce and like Amazon. Okay, well, no one really trained you how to use Amazon. You just know how to spend money on it, and you can find the thing you're looking for and be done with it. Theoretically, identity was kind of supposed to be in that same boat from a access request perspective by this time. I'm not seeing it, at least not consistently enough, where people are like, oh yeah, I do like our identity system. No, I mean, we go into like meetings all the time and they're like, tell me everything that's wrong with with identity, and like most of the time it's the user experience is like a complete mess. So
Yeah.
yeah, you kind of got to figure that out as you go along. But I would certainly hope that people are starting to pay a better attention to the user experience for things like that.
Right. Yeah, and then another thing that I've been working on a lot this week was with a client who, with their IGA platform, they're suffering from poor user experience, primarily due to the data. It's really not the software that they're using. It's the amount of data, the amount of options that they've made available to their users. Sometimes more or sometimes less is more.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, fewer choices sometimes is better for people. It's something that they can get through quicker, that they can understand more. You don't overwhelm them. Um, and yeah, there's fewer choices, so they might not be able to get exactly what they want, but they get what they want. Um, I think the other thing is, uh, I think the goal of an IAM program ought to be automation. So as few choices being presented, are few approvals, fewer less amount of time spent in the IAM system. Those are kind of the goals of a good IAM deployment. So if you use roles to automate access provisioning, even I think it's an area where the 80-20 rule really applies.
Mm-hmm.
Where if you can make it so that 80% of the access is something that is automated, and the managers only have to deal with the exception cases by going into the system and selecting entitlements, or even roles that kind of bundle some of the entitlements. I think that's better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think if you're gonna build something, let's say you're gonna carve something, right? You don't just start with a block of wood and all of a sudden it's a duck, right? I mean, you're whipping away, and chipping away at it and shaving it down, and it's slowly getting formed to where it needs to be. And it's like, oh, that's no longer this block of wood. That's actually a duck, right? Maybe that's a terrible analogy, but I think the idea there is get as close as you can to it, but don't try to like wait till the very end to have like this perfect duck. You can still get a lot of value out of it. So maybe it's the 80-20 rule. Maybe it's not even 80-20. Maybe it's 50-50 in the first year, or 20-80, right?
Yeah.
Iterate on it, get better, demonstrate that you can actually do it, work through the potential issues that might come up. And this is kind of like things is I like to do is dog food it, right? And that basically means is like test it out on yourself. Like, so if the IAM team is building something out, like for role-based access control, for example, or an access request system, do you first put your things in there, see how it works, what works and what doesn't work, make adjustments, then go to a next area that is maybe a little bit friendly, good relations. Hey, do you mind helping us test this out? They know that there might be things that are broken, but you're exploiting that relationship and taking advantage of it. And you work through that stuff, and then you get to the other areas of the business that are going to be difficult, either complexity, maybe not as good a relationship, distrust, whatever that looks like. But I do think it's something you have to just start basic and just continue to iterate on it, and then keep up with it, because that's the other thing too, is what you don't want to do is end up with this catalog that's like stale, doesn't make any sense anymore. It has like accesses from like 5 years ago that no one deleted out, or aren't relevant anymore. Do some cleaning.
That part that you brought up there, though, I think that's a big part of it, which is there's got to be an investment by the business users, the business departments or groups that are going to benefit from the roles. You're only going to get that benefit if you make the investment. If you start to define what are the access patterns that make sense, what are the groupings of access that we need. If somebody's not going to, you can, the IAM group can help by pulling the data, helping to stage it, but ultimately the business got to say, yes, those are the roles, we're going to use them, we understand them. Now you're speaking our language. If they're not willing to make that investment, then um, it's not going to go anywhere. I think,
Right.
like you said, is start small. Find the groups that are willing to work with you, make the investment of time, and start there. Grow from
Yep.
there.
Yeah. So, anything else interesting?
I don't think so.
Okay. Why don't we talk about some of these articles that you and I have been kind of tossing back and forth between each other? I'll let you take this one because this is one you sent me, and I have a very blunt message at the end. But why don't you take this one?
Right, right. So, I mean, one of the big news articles that came out last week was the fact that Russia actually went and arrested some members of this REvil ransomware gang, which on the surface sounds like great news, right? That Russia is actually going out and taking action against these folks who are, um, you know, extorting businesses and organizations, hospitals. Like we've been complaining about ransomware on every one of these live streams since we started. And so finally, Russia stepped up and taken action. And I think the cynical view of it is, and I kind of share in this cynical view, which is that I think they're posturing to show with what's going on, on the border with Ukraine, that hey, look, we could either be friends and we can do things that friends do, like arrest all these bad guys, or we can be enemies.
Mm-hmm.
And so it probably has more to do with that. I think if the U.S. or the West isn't going to play along with Russia on some of these geopolitical things, like not letting Ukraine in NATO, then you might see these people just get released, or you're probably going to see these folks just get released.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think obviously this gets more into the kind of the political domain of it. I see this entire article, all these words, and the only thing that it tells me is they have no idea who they arrested. They don't know if they're high level, low level, if it makes a difference at all. So, cool, I guess. Way to go. I don't know what to say, but I guess my blunt assessment is like, okay, instead of reading this whole article, it's basically like they don't know. This is, and it's right up here at the top. It's let me move this window over here. It's not clear whether developers or low level criminals were arrested. Okay, I think that kind of tells you everything you need to know about that article.
Yeah, and I don't know if I saw it here or somewhere else, but I heard that one of the folks that were, I don't know, it might not have been people in this arrest, but there's somebody in Russia who drives around with a Lamborghini that his license plate says thief in
Yep.
Cyrillic. And that may have been from the podcast that we're gonna, or the webinar that we're gonna talk about in a minute. I
Yeah.
think that's where I heard it.
Let's jump on it because I think that was Roger Grimes. He's been on our show and he's just an awesome speaker. I mean, I love the way he presents, and he gave a webinar on nuclear ransomware 3.0. I think it was yesterday. And we'll put links to all this in our show notes so people can kind of check it out. But he's such a natural presenter, and he talked about sort of the history of ransomware, and we'll touch on that in a little bit of a second here because he works for an organization called Know Before, and I thought it was just great. It's an easy 45-minute kind of presentation, super casual, easy to understand, and like I said, I think he's just a great speaker. And one of the things he touched on was that thief in Cyrillic as the license plate. The other thing he touched on was some of the information that they've collected on the Know Before website around ransomware. So they've actually got a really good collection of things here. It's knowbefore.com/ransomware, and just a ton of information. They even have kind of like the history timeline here of kind of when ransomware kind of came along, and Roger talks through this as part of the presentation he gave the other day. But they also have like this tool, which, I'll be honest, I don't know about it too much, so I'm certainly not condoning it, but it's basically an app that you can download, is my understanding, that will kind of simulate ransomware in your environment. Now, that already is like, okay, so you want me to trust an executable from the internet, install it to test if I should trust executables from the internet. I feel there's a little bit of chicken and egg there, but maybe you're playing on a VM or something like that, and could be interesting. but
Right.
just a ton of stuff here.
You
And
install it and it pops up on your screen like, "Are you that stupid?
right,
You need to
gotcha.
call us right away."
Right, yeah, it's like, yeah, that you failed the first test, which is don't download stuff from the internet. But I think there's just a ton of stuff in here, which is pretty neat. So we'll put a link to that in our show notes or in the YouTube notes here for that. The other one that came up today that I saw on Krebs, Brian Krebs on security website, is this headline around the IRS, which is the U.S. tax authority, soon requiring selfies for online access. And basically, what he's saying is the IRS appears to be partnering with a company called ID.me to do identity proofing, which lines up great with a conversation we had earlier this week with Archit Lokahari from CyberArk, because we actually talked about NIST 800-63, which is the identity guidelines, and proofing was part of that discussion. So it's a pretty long article. It kind of steps through what he went through to create this account, to be able to kind of understand how it is, how it works for the user. I was reading through it. I was like, okay, it kind of makes sense, right? You set up an account, you kind of set up your MFA option, which is great that they have a ton of MFA options that you can select from, which is pretty cool. And then you start getting into this thing of, okay, so how do we do the identity proofing? We need to upload some documentation, right? Whether it's a social security card, or I thought it was interesting, the health insurance card was one of those options. W-2, which generally, basically everything you see here is pretty sensitive information. So you have to make sure that that this stuff is being secured. And that's the whole point, I think, of identity proofing, is how do we match up that the person submitting this is actually the person who is at the keyboard. And that's where the next step comes in, which is, let me scroll down here. You get to this where it's your estimated wait time is 3 hours and 27 minutes to validate your liveness. So basically, is they want you to join a video call, and then, basically someone's going to look at you and say, yep, looks like you, kind of like the bouncer at a bar checking your ID. Is, hey, is this you? I don't know anybody who would sit and wait for 3.5 hours. I guess this is kind of maybe typical kind of government wait times, but this seems like a weak link.
The digital version of the DMV.
Yeah, what is the point of this?
Well, it's surprising that they're not using some form of AI to accomplish this. I mean, I registered for a crypto capability, the ability to sell cryptocurrency on Coinbase, and they went through a document. So if anybody's looking for a sample scenario where you go through this, and I didn't realize that this 3 hour and 27-minute wait was to have somebody come on board and look at you.
Yeah.
But I know on the Coinbase verification process, where it was, essentially doing a liveness check of the video selfie I took and matching it up to my ID, it took long enough where I was starting to worry that the app crashed, right? It was like processing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure that was the time it took for the AI to do whatever algorithm it had to do. Overall, this article gets me thinking about e-voting, right? Because I think this is an opportunity to start to leverage all this technology. I mean, when I think about all the election controversy that we have in the United States, and I'm sure there's election controversy in other countries that I don't hear about as much, but I think a lot of it could be solved with technology. I think we'll have different potential issues when it comes to moving into technology, but I think verifying one person, one vote is really everybody I think can agree with that. And if we get it so that the technology can actually get us there. So anyway, we did an episode of Identity at the Center podcast with Mike Vesey. That was back in November of last year. I'm just trying to see if I can find what episode is episode 122 on digital identity and public sector e-voting. Mm-hmm. So
I think he pointed to Ontario, right? Ontario, Canada is
right.
Kind of
They'd made a lot more progress.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think certainly the technology's there. I think it's the trust and making it equitable for everybody that are still the challenges for getting this into the appropriate hands. But I think over time we'll get there. But
I think the hard part is defining what is equitable then.
Right. that's not my my area, so I'm not going to even worry about it. But
Not our cup of soup.
yeah, not my pig, not my farm. How about that? But I thought it was interesting because he kind of steps through the entire process here. So I guess if you want to check it out more, it's on Krebs on Security, his website, and we'll have a link in our show notes. Do we want to keep going? Because I know we've been talking already here for like 36 minutes, and we originally were talking about doing this. We were talking about doing this for like 15 minutes, and we found it was like, it's hard for us to like force the conversation to be that short. You want to keep going, and maybe we'll do one more?
Let's do one more.
Okay. I like this one
Just
only
one
because
more.
this is another podcast tease. I'm not even sure how you pronounce the company, Permiso, I'm going to guess. But they got seeded with money, and I think we're going to have them on a show at some point, right?
Yeah. Speaking of soup, Permiso. Like miso
Delicious.
Soup. Sounds delicious. Yeah. So, I've been in touch with the co-founder, one of the co-founders of this company. I mean, it's a cloud identity management startup. I mean, these don't pop up every day. And, it's one of a long list of, we are now scheduled out, Jeff, through the end of the year. I'm sorry, not
The year is like, whoa.
Through the end of the quarter. We've got, I'm gonna preview a few people. We got Ward Duchamps, who was the CEO at Scaled Access, Mike Frazier, who's the CISO at Sophos, Upendra Mardikar. He's spent time leading IAM initiatives at PayPal and Amex. He's still in the financial services industry. Alex Fry will be coming back. Frydenty, Fry Guy.
Frydenty, yeah. That was fun.
Yeah, Frydenty. Part stand-up comedian, part identity and access management consultant. We're going to have Paul Fisher from CooperCole, Jack Lydecker, who's the CISO, Dan Creed, who's the CISO, Dieter Schuler from Radiant Logic. I mean, I always say about Dieter, he's been at every identity and access management conference for the last 20 years. I mean, you go through the vendor hall, you're going to see him. I'm hoping to get Julie Smith back on because Identity Management Day is coming up. And, hoping to get Paul Nugent and Jason Martin from Permiso on a podcast before the end of the quarter. So
yeah, it'll be cool because I think that space that they're playing in is this cloud identity, and we're seeing a lot of companies in this area. We had John Morton on from Brightive, for example, several months ago, I guess now, last year, right, since we're in the new year. And I see a lot of companies trying to demystify and simplify this multi-cloud management type of approach. So it'll be interesting to see how Permiso is handling it, and what their spin on making that into English ends up being, right, for people to be actually to do stuff with. So it'll be cool. And we got a lot of great guests coming up, and we'll continue to kind of roll through live streams like this, and hopefully continue to kind of build audience and invite people. We know people listen to the podcast, so hopefully they'll make their way over here and have conversations with us and ask questions and provide their feedback on what we're saying, and tell us if we're wrong, tell us if we're right, or anywhere in between.
Yeah, and by the way, if anybody's listening who has an idea for or a recommendation for somebody to have on the podcast, either leave it in the notes here, hit us up on LinkedIn. Definitely, I think leave it in the comments. And heck, if you've got a story yourself that you want to tell, we're scheduling out to Q2 now, but it'll be here before you know it. I always, behind the scenes or behind the curtain, I'm the guy who handles most of the scheduling. It's a lot of work. And a lot of times I'll get people scheduled out 8 weeks in advance. I'm like, oh, now I can take a break from it. Next thing I do is I look at that, it feels like not so long, and I'm looking at that list and I'm like, oh my gosh, we only have like the next 2 episodes scheduled. I better get busy again. I start stretching it out again.
Yeah, but I like doing, episodes just the two of us, because I think we can dig into something a little bit more and certainly be, I wouldn't say we're less opinionated, but more opinionated, but maybe deep dive into something that's maybe not specific to a technology or a specific area. So I don't mind those as much.
Well, maybe one of these days we'll just do a daily podcast.
Oh yeah. Stop giving me more work.
Yeah, it would have to get to the point where we're getting paid to do the podcast instead of being pirate radio.
Yeah, exactly. I like the pirate radio thing though. I feel like it's kind of like, okay, we do this thing on the side. It's not our real job, but we enjoy
Yeah.
doing it, and we'll keep doing it for as long as we're still having a good time with it. I think it's probably the good thing. All right, we ran longer than usual, but we're still figuring it out. So hopefully people have stuck around at this point. If you liked what you heard, definitely hit that like and subscribe button, hit that notify button. We're still trying to figure out scheduling here. That's the easiest way to know when we're going to go live. I also try to post on Twitter at IDAC Podcast when we're going to go live, usually with more than a couple hours notice, but you never know as we kind of work through this. But yeah, I mean, and share with other people who are of like mind or enemies that you hate and they want to hate watch us. That's cool too. We'll take it. So yeah, with that, anything else, Jim?
No, have a great weekend, everyone.
Yeah. All right. Take care, everyone. We'll talk with everyone in the next one.